The fluorescent lights in the hospital waiting room hummed with the same cruel indifference they had maintained for the past 14 hours. Amelia Martinez pressed her palms against the cool metal of the chair arms, watching her breath fog slightly in the over-conditioned air. Across from her, separated by a chasm of unspoken words and years of accumulated hurt, sat Margaret Sinclair, her mother-in-law, clutching a tissue that had long since disintegrated into damp fragments. The surgery should be finishing soon, Dr. Harrison had said 3 hours ago, his voice carrying that practiced tone medical professionals used when they weren't entirely certain of anything. Now, as the digital clock on the wall clicked past 11:47 p.m., Amelia found herself studying the intricate pattern of Margaret's wedding ring, a massive diamond that had been in the Sinclair family for 4 generations. The same ring Margaret had once declared would never be passed down to someone who doesn't understand our family's values. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here they sat, two women who had spent the better part of 8 years locked in a cold war of passive-aggressive dinner conversations and barely concealed contempt, united now only by the fact that Amelia's kidney was currently being transplanted into Margaret's husband, Amelia's father-in-law, Robert Sinclair. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and desperation, punctuated by the occasional waft of cafeteria coffee that had been brewing since the Clinton administration. Other families occupied the scattered chairs, each group wrapped in their own cocoon of anxiety and hope. A young couple held hands over a shared bag of vending machine cookies. An elderly man dozed fitfully while his daughter read the same magazine page for the 20th time. But in the corner where Amelia and Margaret maintained their vigil, the silence was thick enough to slice. Amelia's phone buzzed against her thigh, and she glanced at the screen to see a text from her sister Rosa. "How are you holding up, Hermana? Mama's lighting candles at St. Catherine's. She says to tell you that you're braver than Joan of Arc and twice as stubborn." Despite everything, a small smile tugged at Amelia's lips. Her family had been her anchor through all of this. The testing, the procedures, the sleepless nights wondering if she was making the right choice. They had never once questioned her decision, even when she couldn't fully explain it to herself. The decision to donate her kidney hadn't come easily. When the call came 6 weeks ago, Margaret's voice breaking over the phone for the first time in Amelia's memory, every instinct had screamed at her to hang up. "Amelia," Margaret had whispered, the words seeming to scrape against her throat. "Robert is dying. The doctors say he needs a kidney, and David isn't a match, and I know things between us haven't been." The sentence had died there, hanging in the space between them like a bridge half built. David, her husband of 8 years, the man who had stood between his wife and his parents like a referee in a boxing match that never quite ended. He was in the ICU now, holding his father's hand and whispering encouragements that Robert couldn't hear through the anesthesia. David had been the one to suggest the testing, his eyes pleading with Amelia across their kitchen table as morning sunlight streamed through the windows of their modest 2-bedroom house in Riverside. The same house Margaret had once described as charming, I suppose, if you're into that urban renewal aesthetic. The testing process had been exhaustive. Blood draws that left Amelia's arms looking like a road map of purple and yellow, psychological evaluations where she sat across from Dr. Patricia Wells, a kind woman with prematurely gray hair, who asked probing questions about Amelia's motivations. "You understand," Dr. Wells had said during their third session, "that kidney donation is major surgery. Recovery can take months. There are risks, infection, bleeding, even death, though that's extremely rare. And given the complexity of your relationship with the recipient's family, I need to be certain you're doing this for the right reasons." What were the right reasons? Amelia had asked herself that question 1,000 times as she lay awake at night, listening to David's steady breathing beside her. Was it love for her husband, who would be devastated to lose his father? Was it some misguided attempt to prove herself worthy of a family that had never accepted her? Or was it something deeper, a stubborn refusal to let hatred win, even when that hatred had been aimed at her like a loaded weapon for nearly a decade? The Sinclair family had money, old money, the kind that came with summer houses in the Hamptons and boarding school traditions and a family crest that supposedly traced back to Scottish nobility. Amelia Martinez, daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress who had immigrated from Guadalajara with nothing but determination and faith, had never fit into that world.
Too loud at dinner parties, too opinionated about politics, too comfortable with her own brown skin in rooms full of people who spoke in carefully coded language about maintaining standards. The first time David brought her home for Christmas, Margaret had served dinner on china that cost more than Amelia's monthly rent. The conversation had been a minefield of seemingly innocent questions that felt like tiny detonations. "Oh, how interesting that you're a public school teacher. David's cousin Ashley teaches too. At Brearley Academy, of course. Much more manageable class sizes there, I imagine. And your parents, they're local?" The emphasis on local had been surgical in its precision, conveying volumes about Margaret's assumptions regarding people who hadn't had the good fortune to be born into the right zip code. But Robert had been different. While Margaret wielded her disapproval like a scalpel, Robert had shown Amelia small kindnesses that felt revolutionary in that house. He would ask about her students, remembering their names from previous conversations. He would compliment her cooking when she and David hosted family dinners, always making a point to say how much he enjoyed the authentic flavors without the patronizing tone that usually accompanied such comments. When Amelia and David bought their house, Robert had shown up unannounced with a truck full of tools and spent the weekend helping them fix a leaky bathroom pipe and paint the guest room. "He sees something in you that his wife refuses to acknowledge," David had told her once, after a particularly tense family gathering where Margaret had spent the entire evening correcting Amelia's pronunciation of French wine names. "My father respects strength, and you're the strongest person I know." Now that strength was literally inside Robert's body, working to keep him alive. The surgical team had explained the process in clinical detail that somehow made it sound both miraculous and routine. They would place her kidney in Robert's lower abdomen, connecting it to blood vessels and the bladder, while leaving his old failed kidneys in place. If all went well, her kidney would begin producing urine within hours, filtering toxins from his blood and giving him years he wouldn't have had otherwise. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us a long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Margaret shifted in her chair, the leather of her handbag creaking as she adjusted her grip. She had aged visibly in the week since Robert's diagnosis, the carefully maintained facade of upper-class composure cracking around the edges. Her usually perfect platinum hair showed dark roots, and her lipstick had long since worn away, leaving her looking smaller somehow, more fragile than Amelia had ever seen her. "I need to call Catherine," Margaret said suddenly, her voice hoarse from hours of minimal use. Catherine was David's sister, currently in London with her investment banker husband, too pregnant to travel but expecting hourly updates. "I need to call Catherine," Margaret said suddenly, her voice hoarse from hours of minimal use. Catherine was David's sister, currently in London with her investment banker husband, too pregnant to travel but expecting hourly updates. "She'll want to know about the timing." Amelia nodded, though Margaret wasn't looking at her. The acknowledgement felt strange on her tongue, but she managed to say, "The surgeon said they'd give us an update as soon as they're closing, probably another hour or two." It was the first exchange they'd had in 3 hours, and it felt monumental. Margaret stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, and walked toward the hallway where cell phone use was permitted. As she passed Amelia's chair, she paused, just for a moment, and her hand hovered near Amelia's shoulder as if she might offer some gesture of comfort or gratitude. But the moment stretched and broke, and Margaret continued down the hall without contact, leaving only the faintest trace of her perfume, white shoulders, the same scent she'd worn to every family gathering for 8 years. Amelia closed her eyes and let herself remember the morning of the surgery. She had awoken before dawn, her body humming with nervous energy despite the pre-surgical fast that left her stomach hollow and aching. David had been awake too, sitting on the edge of their bed with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs he thought she couldn't see. She had reached for him then, pulling him back under the covers, and holding him against her chest while he cried for his father and whispered apologies for everything his family had put her through.
"You don't have to do this," he had said for the 100th time. "My parents, they never deserved your kindness. I know that. I've always known that." But Amelia had known, with the certainty that comes from months of soul-searching and sleepless nights, that she did have to do this. Not for Margaret, who had spent 8 years treating her like an unwelcome guest in her own family. Not even for Robert, though his gentle acceptance had meant more to her than he could know. She was doing this for the woman she wanted to be, the woman who could extend grace, even when it wasn't earned, who could plant seeds of love in soil that seemed determined to remain barren. The recovery would be difficult. 6 weeks of limited activity, months before she could lift anything heavier than 10 pounds, a permanent scar across her abdomen that would serve as a daily reminder of this choice. She would miss the first month of the new school year, leaving her 5th-grade classroom in the hands of a substitute while she healed. Her students had made her a card before summer break. Somehow word had gotten out about the surgery, the way news travels in small communities, and 26 10-year-olds had signed their names around a drawing of a superhero with the words, "Mrs. Martinez saves the day," written in crayon across the top. The sound of footsteps in the hallway drew Amelia's attention, and she looked up to see a familiar figure approaching. Dr. Sarah Kim, the transplant surgeon, still in her surgical scrubs, but with the cap removed to reveal black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her expression was carefully neutral, the professional mask that doctors wore when they carried news that could change everything. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Kim said, settling into the chair Margaret had vacated. "How are you feeling? Any pain at the incision site?" Amelia considered the question honestly. There was pain, a deep pulling ache that the medications couldn't entirely eliminate, but it was manageable. More than that, it felt purposeful. "I'm okay," she said. How did the transplant go?" Dr. Kim's face broke into the first genuine smile Amelia had seen from her all day. "Beautiful," she said, and that single word carried the weight of miracles. "Your kidney began producing urine before we even closed the incision. Mr. Sinclair's body has accepted it without any signs of rejection. His color is already improving, and his vital signs are stronger than we've seen in months." The relief hit Amelia like a physical force, and she found herself gripping the chair arms to steady herself. Is he going to be okay? The next 48 hours will be critical, but all indications are positive. You saved his life, Mrs. Martinez. I want you to understand that. Without this transplant, Mr. Sinclair had maybe weeks left. Now we're talking about years, potentially decades of quality time with his family. Margaret appeared in the hallway then, her phone clutched in her white-knuckled grip, and she must have heard Dr. Kim's words because she stopped walking entirely. For a moment that stretched between heartbeats, Amelia watched 1,000 emotions cross Margaret's face. Relief, gratitude, guilt, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Dr. Kim stood and addressed them both. "You can see Mr. Sinclair in about an hour, once he's settled in the ICU. Just for a few minutes at first. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to go home and rest. Your body needs time to heal, and stress won't help that process." As the doctor walked away, Amelia and Margaret found themselves alone again in the waiting room that had become their temporary purgatory. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different now. Not the brittle quiet of mutual antagonism, but something softer, more fragile. Margaret was still standing in the hallway entrance, her perfectly manicured fingers worrying at the handle of her purse. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" The single word hung in the air between them, loaded with 8 years of unasked questions and unacknowledged hurts. Amelia met her eyes, really looked at her perhaps for the first time since they'd known each other. Margaret's face was streaked with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Her composure, finally, completely shattered. In that moment, she looked nothing like the imperious woman who had spent years making Amelia feel like an outsider. She looked like what she was, a terrified wife who had nearly lost the man she had loved for 43 years.
"Because," Amelia said, her own voice thick with exhaustion and emotion, "sometimes doing the right thing is its own reason. And because Because David loves you both so much. I couldn't let him lose his father, not when I had the power to prevent it. Margaret's composure cracked completely then, and she sank into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support her. I don't understand you, she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. God, Amelia, I've been terrible to you for years. I said things, did things. I made you unwelcome in our family, and I don't even know why. You were so different from what I expected for David, and I was scared that. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Amelia understood. Fear made people do cruel things, made them build walls instead of bridges, made them see threats where they should see blessings. The waiting room clock ticked toward midnight, marking the end of one of the longest days of Amelia's life. Somewhere, in the floors above them, Robert Sinclair was beginning the slow process of healing, her kidney working inside his body to filter toxins and restore balance. David was probably still at his father's bedside, holding vigil in the way that children do when their parents' mortality suddenly becomes real and immediate. And here in the sterile room that smelled of industrial cleaning products and other people's anxiety, two women who had been strangers masquerading as family sat in the aftermath of a miracle, trying to figure out how to move forward from this moment. The surgery was over, the immediate crisis had passed, but Amelia sensed that the real work, the harder work of healing relationships and building bridges, was just beginning. Margaret was still crying, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. I don't know how to thank you for this. I don't know how to make up for. You don't have to, Amelia said quietly. That's not why I did this. But Margaret, if you really want to thank me, then maybe we could try to start over. Not pretend the past didn't happen, but maybe try to build something better going forward. The question that would define everything came then, hanging in the fluorescent lit air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Would Margaret take the offer of grace that Amelia was extending? Would she choose to see this moment as an ending or a beginning? The answer would determine not just the future of their relationship, but the kind of family David's children would grow up knowing, the legacy that would be built on the foundation of this night. But that answer would have to wait, because Dr. Kim was approaching again, this time with David at his side, his face streaked with tears and his eyes bright with hope and exhaustion. The next chapter of their story was about to begin. The morning after the surgery, Amelia woke to the sound of rain pattering against the bedroom window and the persistent ache in her abdomen that reminded her that her body was now fundamentally different. David was already gone. She could hear him in the kitchen, probably making the coffee too strong the way he always did when he was nervous. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 6:23 a.m., and weak September sunlight filtered through the gauze curtains they'd bought at Target during their first year of marriage. Their house in Riverside was a 1920s bungalow that they'd bought for a price that would have made Margaret faint, not because it was expensive, but because it was so modest that she couldn't imagine her son living there. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places. Amelia loved every imperfect corner of it, from the bathroom door that stuck in humid weather to the way the living room walls were painted a soft sage green color that caught the morning light just right. She moved carefully, swinging her legs over the side of the bed and pausing to let the wave of dizziness pass. Dr. Kim had warned her about this, the body's adjustment to major surgery, the way simple movements would feel monumental for the first few weeks. Standing required conscious thought, each step a negotiation between her determination and her body's protests. In the kitchen, David stood at the counter with his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath his old UCLA t-shirt. He was stirring his coffee with unusual intensity, the spoon clicking against the ceramic in an anxious rhythm. The morning newspaper lay folded beside him, unread, unusual for a man who typically consumed the news with his breakfast like it was a required nutrient.
"How's your dad this morning?" Amelia asked, her voice still rough with sleep. David turned, and she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. He'd been up half the night on the phone with his sister Catherine in London, fielding calls from relatives and family friends who'd heard about Robert's condition through the efficient gossip network that connected wealthy families across multiple time zones. "Better," he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "The doctors say his kidney function numbers improved overnight. They're cautiously optimistic." He paused, studying her face with the careful attention of someone looking for signs of pain or regret. "How are you feeling? Really, I mean, not the polite version." Amelia considered the question as she accepted the cup of coffee he offered her, wrapped in her favorite mug, a ceramic piece one of her students had made in art class, slightly lopsided but painted with bright yellow sunflowers. "Like I got hit by a truck," she admitted. "But also proud, I think. Like I did something that mattered." They sat at their small dining table, a thrift store find that David had refinished during the early months of their marriage. The morning routine felt both familiar and strange, the same kitchen, the same mugs, the same husband across from her, but everything fundamentally altered by what she'd chosen to sacrifice for his family. The phone rang, startling them both. David glanced at the caller ID and his expression tightened. "It's my mother." Amelia nodded, though something twisted in her stomach that had nothing to do with the surgery. Margaret's behavior in the waiting room the night before had felt like a breakthrough. But morning light had a way of making midnight revelations seem less permanent. David answered on the fourth ring. "Hi, Mom. Yes, she's right here." He looked at Amelia with raised eyebrows. "She wants to talk to you." The phone felt heavier than it should have as Amelia lifted it to her ear. "Hello, Margaret?" "Amelia." Margaret's voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of the authority that usually characterized her conversations. "I wanted to call, and I needed to. How are you feeling this morning?" It was such a normal question, the kind of thing family members asked each other after medical procedures, but coming from Margaret, it felt revolutionary. "I'm managing," Amelia said carefully. "David says Robert's numbers look good." "Yes, Dr. Kim called this morning. She says the kidney is working beautifully." She paused, and Amelia could hear Margaret's careful breathing on the other end of the line. "Amelia, I've been up all night thinking about what you did, what you sacrificed. And I need you to know that I understand now. I understand what kind of person you are, and I'm ashamed that it took something like this for me to see it." Amelia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 8 years of careful distance beginning to shift. "Margaret, please, let me finish. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after how I've behaved, but I'm asking anyway. When you're feeling better, when the doctors say it's safe for you to travel, would you come to dinner, a real dinner, where we can talk properly, where I can begin to make amends for being the kind of mother-in-law who made you feel unwelcome in your own family?" The offer hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Amelia could feel David watching her face, trying to read her reaction, probably holding his breath as he waited for her response. "I'd like that. When I'm feeling stronger." After she hung up, David reached across the table and took her hand. "What did she say?" "She invited me to dinner. She used the word amends." David's eyes filled with tears, the second time she'd seen him cry in as many days, after years of him being the strong, steady presence in their marriage. "Jesus, Amelia, what you've done, it's changed everything. I don't know how to thank you."
"Don't thank me yet," she said with a wry smile. "Wait and see if I survive your mother's cooking." The joke fell flat because they both knew Margaret didn't cook. The Sinclairs had employed the same housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, for 15 years, and she was the one who prepared the elaborate meals that graced their dining room table. But the attempt at humor revealed something important. Amelia was ready to try. Ready to see if the foundation of mutual respect that had been laid in a hospital waiting room could support the weight of an actual relationship. The next few days passed in a haze of prescribed pain medication and carefully managed movement. Amelia discovered muscles she'd never noticed before as they protested every attempt to bend, lift, or twist. David hovered like an anxious nurse, bringing her magazines and cups of tea and constantly asking if she needed anything until she finally had to send him back to work just to get some peace. Her own family descended like a loving army. Her mother, Elena, arrived on Tuesday morning with enough homemade food to feed a small village and immediately began reorganizing Amelia's kitchen according to what she declared were proper recovery principles. Rosa came by every evening after her shift at the hospital, where she worked as a radiology technician, bringing gossip from their neighborhood and updates on their cousins' various romantic dramas. "Mija," Elena said on Thursday afternoon, as she folded laundry with the precision of someone who had been doing other people's washing since she was 12 years old, "I still don't understand why you did this thing for people who have been so unkind to you." It was a conversation they'd had multiple times, but Amelia could hear that her mother was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply criticizing. Elena Martinez had worked as a seamstress for 30 years, taking in alterations and custom work to help support her family, and she had developed a finely tuned sense for people's characters based on how they treated service workers. Margaret's behavior toward Mrs. Chen, toward the servers at restaurants, toward the cleaning staff at the country club, all of it had registered in Elena's mental catalog of character assessments. "Because," Amelia said, shifting carefully on the couch to face her mother, "because sometimes you have to be the person you want to see in the world, even when the world hasn't earned it yet, especially then." Elena's hands paused in their folding, and she looked at her daughter with the expression she wore when she was trying to solve a particularly complex alteration. "You get this from your father, you know, this stubborn need to fix things that other people broke." Amelia's father, Miguel, was indeed a fixer. Of cars, of appliances, of neighbors' problems that somehow always ended up on his workbench in the garage. He had taught her that broken things were just puzzles, waiting for the right combination of patience and persistence. Maybe that's what she was trying to do with Margaret. Find the right tools to repair something that had been damaged before she even arrived on the scene. On Friday, a flower arrangement arrived that was so enormous it barely fit through the front door. 24 white roses surrounded by eucalyptus and baby's breath, arranged in a crystal vase that probably cost more than Amelia made in a month. The card was simple: "With our deepest gratitude and respect, Margaret and Robert Sinclair." David found her crying over the flowers when he came home from work, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in the fragrant blooms. "Hey, what's wrong? Are you in pain?" "They're beautiful," she managed between tears. I never thought I'd see the day when your mother sent me flowers. Real flowers. Not the polite ones she sends for birthdays that feel like obligations." He held her carefully, mindful of her incision, and they stood together in their small living room, surrounded by the scent of roses and the promise of something new growing between people who once seemed destined to remain strangers. The weekend brought David's sister Catherine, who flew in from London despite her pregnancy and her husband's concerns about international travel. Catherine had always been more openly accepting of Amelia than Margaret, but there had still been a distance between them. Careful politeness of people who were connected by marriage, but not by choice. Now, as she sat in Amelia's living room with her hands resting on her expanding belly, something had shifted. "I keep thinking about what you did," Catherine said, her British accent softened by emotion. "I keep trying to imagine myself in your position, and I honestly don't know if I would have been brave enough or generous enough." Catherine was 6 months pregnant with her first child, a daughter she planned to name Elizabeth after Robert's mother. The ultrasound photos she showed Amelia revealed a perfect profile, tiny fingers pressed against her face as if she were deep in thought. "She'll grow up knowing about this," Catherine continued, "about what her Aunt Amelia did to save her grandfather's life. That's the kind of story that shapes a person's understanding of what family means." The word aunt hit Amelia unexpectedly hard. In 8 years of marriage, Catherine had never once referred to her as family, always keeping their interactions cordial but distinctly formal. Now, suddenly, she was Aunt Amelia, not just David's wife, but a real member of the family constellation that orbited around the Sinclair name. On Sunday, Robert called. His voice was weak but determined, and Amelia could hear the hospital sounds in the background, the soft beeping of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum floors. "I wanted to hear your voice," he said. "I wanted to thank you properly when I could find the words." They talked for 20 minutes, and for the first time in their 8-year acquaintance, the conversation felt easy and natural. Robert told her about the view from his hospital window, the parking lot where he'd been watching the same security guard make his rounds every 2 hours. He asked about her recovery, about her pain levels, and about when she thought she might feel up to visitors. He mentioned, almost casually, that Margaret had been reading to him, something she hadn't done since their early years of marriage, and that she had chosen a book of poetry by Pablo Neruda. "She said she thought you might appreciate the choice," Robert said, with a chuckle that turned into a cough. "I think she's trying to educate herself about the things that matter to you." After the call ended, Amelia lay on the couch and thought about Margaret, sitting in a hospital room, reading Spanish love poetry to her husband, with Amelia's kidney working inside his body. The image was so surreal, so far from anything she could have imagined 6 months ago, that she laughed out loud. David found her there an hour later, still smiling. "What's so funny? Your mother is reading Pablo Neruda to your father." David's eyebrows shot up. "My mother, who thinks foreign literature is unnecessarily complicated? The very same." He sat on the edge of the couch and took her hand. "You know what this means, don't you?" "What?" "It means she's really trying. My mother doesn't do anything halfway. If she's decided to understand you, she's going to research you like she's writing a doctoral thesis. By the time you're recovered, she'll probably know more about Latin American poetry than you do." The thought was both amusing and slightly terrifying. Margaret's version of making amends might involve completely immersing herself in Amelia's cultural background, probably with the same intensity she brought to organizing charity galas and managing household staff. It would be exhausting and overwhelming, and probably involve several awkward conversations about immigration policy and social justice issues that Margaret had never needed to consider before. But it would also be an attempt, perhaps the first genuine attempt Margaret had ever made to see the world through Amelia's eyes. And that, Amelia realized, was more than she had ever expected or even hoped for. It was during one of these walks that she ran into Jennifer Mason, a colleague from school who lived 3 blocks away. Jennifer taught 2nd grade and had been one of the few people Amelia had confided in about the kidney donation. "Amelia, how are you feeling? We've all been worried sick about you." They stood on the sidewalk in front of the small park where neighborhood children played after school, the autumn air crisp with the promise of changing seasons. Jennifer's concern was genuine. She was one of those naturally nurturing people who remembered everyone's birthday and organized meal trains for colleagues going through difficult times. "I'm doing well," Amelia said, automatically adjusting her posture to minimize any visible signs of discomfort. "Ready to get back to the classroom?" "About that," Jennifer's expression grew complicated. "I probably shouldn't be the one to tell you this, but there's been talk in the teacher's lounge about what you did, about donating a kidney to your father-in-law after the way his family has treated you." Amelia felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got whenever she sensed judgment coming her way. "What kind of talk?" "Well, some people think it was incredibly noble. Sarah Chen says you're like a saint, and Tom Morrison keeps telling everyone that you're the most generous person he's ever known." Jennifer paused, clearly wrestling with whether to continue, but others are saying you were manipulated, that your in-laws guilted you into it, or that you were trying to buy their approval. The words stung, partly because Amelia had wondered the same things herself during the long nights before the surgery. Had she been motivated by pure altruism or by some desperate need to prove herself worthy of acceptance?
Did it matter as long as the outcome saved Robert's life? "What do you think?" Amelia asked quietly. Jennifer considered the question seriously, her teacher's mind working through the complexities. "She thinks," she said finally, "that motivation is rarely simple. I think you probably had a dozen different reasons for doing what you did, and some of them were noble, and some of them were human, and all of them were yours to have. The important thing is that a man is alive because of your choice, and that's something to be proud of regardless of what anyone else thinks." They parted ways with promises to catch up properly once Amelia was back at work, but the conversation lingered in her mind as she completed her walk home. The idea that her colleagues were dissecting her motivations, debating whether her sacrifice was pure enough to merit their approval, felt violating in a way she hadn't expected. She had given part of her body to save someone's life, and somehow that had become fodder for break room psychology. When she got home, Davy was in the kitchen preparing what he optimistically called dinner, but which looked more like an elaborate science experiment involving pasta, vegetables, and several condiments that had no business being in the same dish. Cooking had never been his strength, but he'd been trying to take care of her in the ways he knew how. "How was your walk?" he asked, looking up from his culinary creation with an expression of concentrated confusion. "Educational," Amelia said, settling onto one of their kitchen stools. "I learned that everyone at school has an opinion about my kidney donation." David's expression darkened. "What kind of opinions?" She told him about the conversation with Jennifer, watching his face cycle through anger, protectiveness, and frustration. When she finished, he set down his wooden spoon and came around the counter to stand beside her.
"You know what I think?" he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I think people feel guilty when they see someone do something truly selfless, because it forces them to examine their own capacity for sacrifice. It's easier to find selfish motives in your actions than to admit they wouldn't have done the same thing." It was probably true, but that didn't make the judgment easier to bear. Amelia had spent most of her adult life being scrutinized, first as the scholarship kid at her prestigious college, then as the brown girl in predominantly white spaces, and finally as the working-class daughter-in-law in a family that valued pedigree above character. She had hoped that doing something unambiguously good might insulate her from that kind of analysis, but apparently no action was too pure to be dissected and found wanting by people who needed to believe that genuine altruism was impossible. "I'm tired of being everyone's psychological case study," she said, leaning against David's shoulder. "I just want to heal and get back to my classroom and pretend that giving away a kidney is a perfectly normal thing that people do on random Tuesdays." David laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Well, when you put it that way, it does sound pretty crazy." That evening, as they sat together on their couch, watching a movie neither of them was really following, Amelia's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short, but stopped her heart. "This is Elizabeth Morrison, Robert's sister. I heard about what you did. I need to see you." Elizabeth Morrison was Margaret's older sister, a woman who had perfected the art of making disapproval feel like physical violence. She had been notably absent from family gatherings in recent years, citing various health concerns and travel commitments, but everyone knew the real reason. She disapproved of David's marriage even more vocally than Margaret did. Where Margaret wielded passive aggression like a surgical instrument, Elizabeth used blunt force trauma. "Who is it?" David asked, noticing her expression. "Your Aunt Elizabeth wants to see me." David's face went pale. "What? Why? She hasn't spoken to us since our wedding reception, and even then she only managed about 3 words. Amelia remembered that conversation vividly. Elizabeth had cornered her near the cake table and delivered what she clearly considered sage advice. Marriage is difficult enough without adding unnecessary complications. The implication was clear as crystal. Amelia was the unnecessary complication that would inevitably lead to the destruction of David's happiness. "Maybe she wants to thank me," Amelia suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. "Or maybe she wants to tell you that you're still not good enough for the family, kidney donation or not." The possibility hung between them like a storm cloud. Elizabeth Morrison was old money in the truest sense. Her grandfather had been a railroad baron, her father a federal judge, her late husband a Supreme Court clerk who had argued cases that changed constitutional law. She lived in a Georgian mansion in Pacific Palisades that had been featured in Architectural Digest, surrounded by art that belonged in museums, and furniture that had been in her family for generations. If Margaret had been difficult to win over, Elizabeth would be impossible. She had never needed to work, had never been questioned or challenged, had never had to consider that her worldview might be limited by the bubble of privilege that had surrounded her from birth. The idea of this woman sitting in judgment of Amelia's motivations for saving her brother's life was almost unbearable. "I have to see her," Amelia said finally. "If I don't, she'll just assume I'm afraid of her disapproval. And honestly, I am afraid. But I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions." David reached for her hand. "You don't have to do this alone. I'll come with you." "No," Amelia said, the certainties surprising her. "This is something I need to do by myself. If Elizabeth is going to accept me, it has to be on my own terms, not because her nephew is there to defend me."
They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a tea room in Pasadena, neutral ground that wouldn't give either woman a home field advantage. Amelia spent the morning trying to decide what to wear, eventually settling on a simple navy dress that struck the right balance between respectful and confident. She wasn't dressing to impress Elizabeth Morrison, that was a fool's errand, but she wanted to feel like herself, like the woman who had made a conscious choice to extend grace even when it wasn't deserved. The tea room was exactly the kind of place Elizabeth would choose. Understated elegance with bone china and silver service, the sort of establishment where conversations were conducted in hushed tones and every detail was designed to reinforce subtle hierarchies of taste and breeding. Amelia arrived first, choosing a table near the window where afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains and cast everything in a soft, forgiving glow. Elizabeth entered like a force of nature, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her black Chanel suit immaculate despite the October heat. She was smaller than Amelia remembered, but her presence filled the room in the way that only people accustomed to deference could manage. The hostess practically genuflected as she showed Elizabeth to the table, and several other patrons looked up from their conversations to nod respectfully. "Amelia," Elizabeth said, settling into her chair with the fluid grace of someone who had been taught proper posture before she could walk. "You look well." It was not the opening Amelia had expected. No criticism of her choice of venue, no subtle commentary on her appearance, just a straightforward observation delivered without obvious judgment. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Amelia replied, falling back on the formal politeness that had carried her through 8 years of uncomfortable family interactions. Elizabeth ordered Earl Grey tea and cucumber sandwiches, with the authority of someone who had never been told that something wasn't available. When the server left, she turned her full attention to Amelia, and it felt like being examined under a microscope. "I imagine you're wondering why I wanted to see you." The thought had crossed my mind. "I owe you an apology," Elizabeth said, and the words hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. "Actually, I owe you several apologies, but we'll start with the most recent one. When I heard about Robert's condition, my first thought wasn't concern for my brother's health or gratitude for your sacrifice. It was skepticism about your motivations." Amelia felt something twist in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of skepticism?" "I assumed you were doing it for show, to finally force your way into the family's good graces, or to put Margaret in your debt, or to prove some point about your moral superiority." Elizabeth's voice was steady, clinical, as if she were discussing someone else's character flaws. "I spent considerable time crafting exactly the right words to put you in your place, to make it clear that one grand gesture wouldn't erase years of incompatibility." The tea arrived, providing a welcome interruption as they went through the ritual of pouring and stirring. Amelia used the time to process what Elizabeth had just revealed, the casual cruelty of it and the unexpected honesty. "What changed your mind?" Amelia asked finally. Elizabeth's smile was rueful, transforming her face into something warmer and more human. "My brother called me yesterday.
He wanted to tell me about his recovery, about how well the kidney is functioning, about how the doctors are amazed by his progress. She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. But mostly, he wanted to tell me about you. What did he say? He told me that you never once mentioned the years of tension between you and Margaret, that when the doctors explained the risks of the surgery, you didn't ask for any promises or commitments from our family. You didn't try to negotiate better treatment or demand recognition. You just did what needed to be done. Elizabeth's voice grew softer.
We're being prepped for surgery? You asked if someone could call your students' parents to let them know you'd be out longer than expected because you didn't want the children to worry. Amelia remembered that conversation with the surgical nurse, a throwaway comment about her fifth graders that had seemed important in the moment. She hadn't realized Robert knew about it. That's when I understood, Elizabeth continued, that I had been applying my own framework to your actions. I had been assuming you thought like I think, that you calculated cost and benefit the way I do, but you don't, do you? It wasn't really a question, but Amelia answered anyway. I try not to. Life gets pretty miserable when every kindness has a price tag attached to it. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, studying Amelia's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling her for years. You know, I've spent my entire adult life in social circles where generosity is performative, where people donate to charities for the tax benefits and the social recognition, where volunteer work is something you do to get your name in the right newspapers. I had forgotten that there are people who simply do good things because they're good things to do. The admission felt monumental, coming from a woman who had never shown vulnerability or uncertainty. Amelia found herself leaning forward, drawn into this unexpected moment of connection. I'm not a saint, Amelia said quietly. I had complicated reasons for donating that kidney. Some of them were probably selfish, wanting David to be happy, wanting to prove something to myself, wanting to be the kind of person who could rise above petty grudges. But in the end, those reasons didn't matter as much as the simple fact that I had something Robert needed to live. That's what makes it remarkable, Elizabeth said. Saints' stained glass windows are easy to admire because they're not real. But you're a real person who made a real sacrifice with real consequences, and you did it anyway. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their tea and watching the afternoon light shift across the lace tablecloth. Amelia felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. This conversation wasn't going to erase 8 years of feeling like an outsider in David's family, but it was creating space for something new to grow. I have a confession, Elizabeth said eventually. I've been reading about you. Reading about me? Research. I wanted to understand who you really are beyond the assumptions I had made. Elizabeth's cheeks colored slightly, the first time Amelia had ever seen her look embarrassed. I found articles about your teaching methods, interviews you gave to the local newspaper about the literacy program you developed for struggling readers. I found the petition you organized to save the school library when the district wanted to cut funding. Amelia felt exposed, as if Elizabeth had been reading her diary. You didn't need to do that. Yes, I did. Because I realized that in 8 years of family gatherings, I had never once asked you about your work, your interests, your goals. I treated you like a temporary inconvenience rather than a person with her own accomplishments and value. Elizabeth reached across the table and touched Amelia's hand briefly. You're an extraordinary teacher. The parents who wrote letters to support your literacy program describe you as someone who changed their children's lives. One mother said her son went from hating reading to carrying books everywhere because of the way you made stories come alive for him. The praise was overwhelming, coming from someone who had never offered Amelia so much as basic courtesy. Teaching is it's who I am. I can't imagine doing anything else. That's what makes you good at it, and that's what I failed to see all these years. Elizabeth straightened in her chair, her voice taking on a more formal tone. I want to make you an offer. Amelia's stomach clenched.
What kind of offer?
I sit on the board of the Westmont Academy. It's a private school with an excellent reputation and resources that public schools can only dream of. They're looking for a new head of their elementary program, someone with innovative teaching methods and a track record of success with diverse student populations. Westmont Academy. Amelia knew the name. It was where Elizabeth's own children had gone to school, where the children of movie stars and tech moguls learned alongside the offspring of old money families. It was the kind of place that charged more in annual tuition than Amelia made in a year. I don't think I'm what they're looking for, Amelia said carefully. On the contrary, I think you're exactly what they need. Private schools can become insular, focused on maintaining traditions rather than developing innovative approaches to education. You could bring fresh perspectives, challenge their assumptions about how children learn best. Elizabeth's eyes were bright with enthusiasm. The position comes with a substantial salary increase, full benefits, and the kind of resources that would let you implement programs on a scale you could never achieve in the public system. It was a generous offer, more generous than anything Amelia could have imagined receiving from Elizabeth Morrison, but something about it felt wrong, like accepting charity disguised as opportunity. Why? Amelia asked. Why now? Why this? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Because I want to do something meaningful to thank you for saving my brother's life. But more than that, because I've realized that I've been part of a family that has wasted years, failing to appreciate someone remarkable. I can't give you back those years, but I can try to give you opportunities that match your talents. The offer hung between them, tempting and troubling in equal measure. Amelia could imagine the resources Elizabeth was describing, the chance to work with smaller class sizes and unlimited supplies, the ability to develop programs without constantly fighting for funding. But she could also imagine the subtle pressure to be grateful, to prove herself worthy of Elizabeth's patronage, to become the family's pet charity case who had been rescued from the mediocrity of public education. I need to think about it, Amelia said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. Elizabeth signaled for the check with a discreet gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and respect for the server. But Amelia, I want you to know that this offer isn't conditional on your gratitude or your willingness to pretend the past didn't happen. It's simply recognition of your abilities and an attempt to make amends for my own blindness. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth stood and surprised Amelia by embracing her, a brief but genuine hug that felt like the breaking of an 8-year-old dam. Thank you, Elizabeth whispered against her ear, for saving Robert, yes, but also for showing me what I've been missing all these years. You're going to be a wonderful addition to this family, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. Walking back to her car, Amelia felt as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis. In the span of 2 weeks, she had given away a kidney, received flowers from her formerly hostile mother-in-law, been invited to dinner by the woman who had spent years making her feel unwelcome, and now been offered a dream job by the family member who had represented everything she thought she could never overcome. The changes were dizzying and wonderful and slightly terrifying. She had set out to save Robert's life, but somehow in the process, she seemed to have transformed the entire family dynamic that had defined her marriage. The question now was whether these changes would survive the intensity of crisis that had created them, whether forgiveness and acceptance born in a hospital waiting room could translate into lasting relationships built in the ordinary moments of everyday life.
3 weeks after the surgery, Amelia returned to Lincoln Elementary School to find her classroom exactly as she had left it, except for a banner stretched across the whiteboard that read, "Welcome back, Hero Teacher," in construction paper letters that could only have been crafted by 10-year-old hands. Her students had also left individual notes on each desk. Crayon drawings of kidneys with smiley faces, heartfelt messages in invented spelling, and one particularly touching card from Marcus, her most reluctant leader, that simply said, "Thank you for being brave, Mrs. Martinez. I want to be brave like you." The first week back was harder than she had anticipated. The incision site still ached when she bent to help students out their desks, and the emotional weight of constant questions about her heroic sacrifice left her drained in ways that surprised her. Parents who had never spoken to her beyond perfunctory conference conversations now approached her with tearful gratitude, as if her kidney donation had somehow elevated her from mere teacher to saint. But it was the subtle changes in her colleagues' behavior that proved most unsettling. The same people who had been gossiping about her motivations now treated her with a careful reverence that felt almost as uncomfortable as their previous skepticism. Teachers who had eaten lunch at the same table for years now seemed to view her as too noble for ordinary conversation. Even the principal, Dr. Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, began including her in administrative discussions she'd never been part of before, as if moral authority somehow translated to educational leadership. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume that doesn't fit," she confided to Rosa during one of their evening phone calls. "Everyone keeps treating me like I did something miraculous, when really I just made a decision that felt right at the time." "Maybe that's exactly what makes it miraculous," Rosa replied, with the practical wisdom that had made her the family's unofficial therapist. "The fact that you don't see it as a big deal is probably why you were able to do it in the first place." The dinner invitation from Margaret came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered via a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery that probably cost more per sheet than most people spent on lunch. "Dear Amelia," it read in Margaret's precise Palmer method script, "Robert and I would be honored if you and David would join us for dinner this Saturday evening. Mrs. Chen is preparing paella, and I've asked her to include all the traditional ingredients you mentioned enjoying at that Spanish restaurant in Santa Monica. 7 o'clock, if that suits your schedule. With love and gratitude, Margaret." The casualness of the invitation, the assumption that Amelia would remember mentioning a preference for paella, the inclusion of love in the closing, suggested a familiarity that had never existed between them. It was Margaret's way of trying to rewrite their history, to pretend that 8 years of careful distance had been replaced overnight by genuine affection. David was cautiously optimistic as they dressed for dinner on Saturday evening. "Maybe this is it," he said, adjusting his tie in their bedroom mirror. "Maybe we can finally be a normal family." Amelia smoothed her black dress, the same one she'd worn to their wedding reception 8 years ago, chosen now as a kind of test to see if Margaret would remember it and how she would react. "I'm not sure we were ever meant to be a normal family," she replied. "But maybe we can be a functional one." The Sinclair house in Hancock Park looked exactly as it had always done, a Georgian colonial that belonged in a magazine spread about tasteful wealth. The landscaping was perfect without appearing designed, the kind of effortless elegance that required a team of professionals to maintain. As they walked up the flagstone path, Amelia tried to identify what felt different about approaching this house as someone who had saved the life of one of its inhabitants. Mrs. Chen answered the door with a smile warmer than any Amelia had ever received in this house. "Mrs. Martinez, how are you feeling? We have been so worried, so grateful." She trailed off, her English emotion overwhelming her usual grammatical precision, and squeezed Amelia's hands with genuine affection. The living room had been transformed with small but significant changes. Where family photos had once displayed only Margaret, Robert, David, and Catherine, new frames now included pictures from David and Amelia's wedding reception, their anniversary celebrations, holiday gatherings that Amelia had attended but never felt truly part of. It was Margaret's way of retroactively including her in the family narrative, and the effort was both touching and slightly desperate.
Robert appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a walker. His face gaunt, but his eyes bright with life that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. The transformation was startling. His skin had color again, his posture was straighter, and when he smiled at Amelia, it reached his eyes in a way that conveyed gratitude beyond words. "My dear girl," he said, his voice stronger than she had heard it in months. "Look at you, beautiful as ever, and practically glowing with good health." The embrace he offered was careful but genuine, and Amelia could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the warmth of circulation that her kidney was helping to maintain. It was a profound thing to hug someone and know that part of your body was keeping them alive. Margaret entered from the kitchen wearing an apron over her silk blouse, a sight so unprecedented that David actually did a double take. In 8 years of family dinners, Margaret had never served the food herself,
had never appeared anything less than perfectly composed and camera-ready. Now she looked almost nervous, like a hostess desperate to make a good impression on important guests. "Amelia, darling," Margaret said, the endearment falling from her lips with obvious unfamiliarity. "How are you feeling? Really, I mean, not the polite answer you give to acquaintances." It was exactly the same question David had asked weeks ago, but coming from Margaret, it felt like an attempt to claim intimacy they had never shared. "I'm well," Amelia replied carefully. "Still getting tired more easily than usual, but the doctors say that's normal." Of course, of course. Major surgery, after all." Margaret's hands fluttered nervously. "I've been reading about kidney donation recovery. Did you know that most donors report feeling psychologically better after the procedure? Something about the satisfaction of helping someone. Though, of course, your situation is, well, it's extraordinary." Dinner was served in the formal dining room on the china that once intimidated Amelia, but now simply struck her as unnecessarily complicated. The paella was perfectly prepared, rich with saffron and studded with prawns and mussels that must have cost a fortune to source fresh. Mrs. Chen had clearly been instructed to spare no expense, and the result was a meal that tasted like an apology served on ancestral porcelain. The conversation was careful and slightly surreal, like a performance where everyone was trying to remember lines to a play they'd never rehearsed. Margaret asked about Amelia's students with what seemed like genuine interest, remembering details from conversations Amelia didn't recall having. Robert shared stories from his recovery that positioned Amelia as the hero of a narrative that felt foreign to her own experience of events. "The nurses keep telling me how lucky I am," Robert said as Mrs. Chen served dessert, flan that was clearly a nod to Amelia's heritage, though she had never expressed any particular fondness for the dessert. "Lucky to have such a generous daughter-in-law, lucky to have family who would make such a sacrifice. I keep telling them it's not luck at all. It's grace." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that went beyond the religious context Robert probably intended. Grace, unmerited favor, forgiveness extended without requirement for atonement, love offered despite a history of rejection. It was a concept that Amelia's Catholic upbringing had taught her to value, but one she had never expected to see recognized in a family that seemed to believe love should be earned through achievement and conformity. After dinner, Margaret suggested they move to the library for coffee, a room Amelia had never been invited to enter during 8 years of family gatherings. It was Robert's domain, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive oak desk that had belonged to his grandfather. The chairs were deep and comfortable, the kind of furniture designed for long conversations and serious contemplation. "There's something we need to discuss," Margaret said once they were settled with their coffee. Her tone had shifted, becoming more formal and purposeful. "Robert and I have been talking about making some changes to our wills, to our estate planning, to the way we think about family and legacy." Amelia felt David tense beside her. Estate planning in the Sinclair family was a topic fraught with complications, involving trusts and charitable foundations and tax implications that required teams of lawyers to navigate. It was also deeply political, a way of expressing approval and disapproval that could echo through generations.
"We've decided to establish a scholarship fund," Margaret continued, "in your name, Amelia. The Amelia Martinez Sinclair Educational Excellence Fund, to support first-generation college students pursuing careers in education." The gesture was generous and thoughtful, but also problematic in ways that Margaret probably hadn't considered. Adding the Sinclair name to Amelia's identity felt presumptuous, a way of claiming ownership of her sacrifice and her values. The scholarship itself, while meaningful, transformed her personal decision into a public monument that would forever link her kidney donation to the family's philanthropic legacy. That's very generous," Amelia said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with having my name attached to Please, Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying a desperation that surprised everyone in the room. Please let us do this. I need to do something to honor what you've done, to show the world that we understand the magnitude of your gift. It was the first time Margaret had used the word gift to describe the kidney donation, and something about it felt wrong to Amelia. Gifts were freely given without expectation of reciprocation, but Margaret seemed to be treating the kidney as a debt that required payment in the form of public recognition and financial generosity. I didn't do it to be honored, Amelia said quietly. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Making it into some kind of monument feels like it misses the point. Robert leaned forward in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What would you prefer? How can we express our gratitude in a way that feels right to you? It was the first time anyone in the Sinclair family had asked Amelia what she wanted, rather than assuming they knew what was best for her. The question forced her to examine her own discomfort with their attempts at gratitude, to articulate something she had been feeling, but not fully understanding. I don't need grand gestures. I don't need scholarships in my name or public recognition or any kind of repayment. What I need is for us to build a real relationship based on who we actually are, not on some idealized version of events where I'm the saint and you're the grateful beneficiaries. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken complexity. Margaret's face cycled through surprise, hurt, and something that might have been relief. David was watching his parents with the careful attention of someone trying to navigate family dynamics that had suddenly become uncharted territory. You're right, of course, Margaret said finally. I've been so focused on the magnitude of what you did that I've been treating you like a character in a story instead of a person. It's easier somehow to put you on a pedestal than to admit that I spent 8 years being wrong about you. The admission was more honest than anything Margaret had ever shared with Amelia, and it revealed the depth of her struggle to process both her gratitude and her guilt. For 8 years, she had constructed elaborate justifications for her treatment of her daughter-in-law, convincing herself that her concerns about social compatibility and family standards were legitimate. The kidney donation had demolished those justifications overnight, leaving her scrambling to rebuild her understanding of both Amelia and herself. I don't want to be on a pedestal, Amelia said gently. Pedestals are lonely places, and I'm tired of feeling isolated in this family. If you really want to honor what happened, then let's work on building something real between us. Let's have awkward conversations about politics and religion. Let's disagree about things without it becoming a referendum on whether I belong here. Let's be actual family members who don't always like each other, but choose to love each other anyway. Robert chuckled, the sound rich with affection and understanding. That sounds wonderfully normal and terrifying. All the best relationships are, Amelia replied. As they prepared to leave that evening, Margaret walked Amelia to the door while David and Robert continued their conversation in the library. For a moment, they stood together in the marble foyer surrounded by oil paintings of Robert's ancestors, two women who had spent years as opponents, finally seeing each other clearly.
I have a confession, Margaret said, her voice soft enough that it wouldn't carry to the men in the next room. I've been going to therapy. The revelation was stunning. Margaret had always presented herself as someone who had life figured out, who could handle any challenge through proper planning and social connections. The idea of her sitting in a therapist's office, examining her own behavior and motivations, suggested a level of vulnerability that Amelia had never imagined she possessed. What made you decide to do that? Your kidney, Margaret said simply. Sitting in that waiting room, watching you sacrifice your health for my husband's life after years of me treating you like an unwelcome intruder. It broke something open in me. I realized that I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who could look at genuine goodness and find reasons to reject it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she made no attempt to wipe away.
My therapist says I've been protecting myself from feeling inferior by making other people feel unwelcome. She says it's a common response to insecurity, especially among people who have built their identity around external validation. It was the most psychologically sophisticated thing Amelia had ever heard Margaret say, and it suggested months of difficult work examining patterns of behavior that probably had been decades in the making. "How does it feel?" Amelia asked. "The therapy, I mean." "Terrifying and liberating in equal measure," Margaret replied with a laugh that sounded younger than her years. "Turns out I have a lot of opinions about things I never realized I was thinking about, and a lot of fears I never admitted I was carrying." They embraced then, and this time it felt natural rather than obligatory. Margaret's perfume was the same. White shoulders, expensive and elegant. But underneath it, Amelia detected something new, something that smelled like authenticity and the possibility of genuine connection. Driving home through the quiet streets of Hancock Park, Amelia and David processed the evening's revelations in comfortable silence. The dinner had been a success in ways neither of them had anticipated, not because it had erased 8 years of tension, but because it had acknowledged that tension honestly and created space for something different to grow. "Your mother is going to therapy," Amelia said as they pulled into their driveway. "I heard," David replied, his voice full of wonder. "I never thought I'd see the day when Margaret Sinclair admitted she might not have all the answers." "People can change," Amelia mused, thinking about the woman who had served dinner in her own kitchen, who had asked permission before honoring her daughter-in-law's sacrifice, who had cried while admitting years of insecurity and fear. "Does that include you?" David asked gently. "Are you ready to change too? To let them be part of your life in a way they've never been before?" It was a fair question. Amelia had spent 8 years building walls of her own, protecting herself from rejection by maintaining careful distance, expecting disappointment so she wouldn't be surprised by it. The kidney donation had torn down Margaret's walls, but Amelia realized she would have to make her own choice about whether to demolish the defenses that had served her for so long. "I think so," she said finally, "but it's going to take time. Trust doesn't grow overnight, even when it's planted in very fertile ground." About Westmont Academy's curriculum and mission, making it clear that the opportunity was genuine rather than a gesture of charity. But not every interaction was smooth. At David's birthday dinner, Margaret made an offhand comment about people who work in public service that carried undertones of her old condescension. When Amelia called her out on it, gently but directly, Margaret's first instinct was to become defensive, to retreat into the patterns of behavior that had defined their relationship for years. "I didn't mean anything by it," Margaret said, her voice taking on the cool tone that had once been her weapon of choice. "You were being overly sensitive." "Maybe I am," Amelia replied evenly. "But when someone has spent 8 years making you feel like your career choice is somehow inferior, you tend to notice comments that seem to continue that pattern." The table fell silent, everyone suddenly fascinated by their plates. It was the first real conflict since the surgery, the first test of whether their newfound respect could survive honest disagreement. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Amelia could see her struggling with competing impulses, the desire to defend herself warring with her commitment to change. Finally, she set down her fork and looked directly at Amelia. "You're right," she said simply. "I did mean something by it, even if I didn't realize it in the moment. I'm still learning how to talk about your work without letting my own biases show through. I'm sorry." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest and immediate, without the elaborate justifications that had characterized Margaret's previous attempts at damage control. More importantly, it demonstrated a willingness to be corrected, to accept feedback about behavior that needed changing. "Thank you," Amelia said, "and thank you for not making me feel like I'm being unreasonable for asking." The evening continued, the tension gradually easing as conversation moved to safer topics. But something important had happened. They had navigated their first conflict as people committed to building a relationship rather than as opponents looking for reasons to disengage. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental in the context of their shared history. The real test came a month later, during the first family gathering since the surgery that included extended relatives. Margaret's sister Elizabeth had organized a dinner party to celebrate Robert's recovery, inviting cousins and family friends who hadn't seen Amelia in years and had heard about the kidney donation through the family gossip network. Amelia Martinez never expected her love story with David Sinclair to become an 8-year battle for acceptance within their wealthy, traditional family. When she first met David at a teaching conference, their connection was immediate and profound. Two educators passionate about making a difference in children's lives. But when David brought his Mexican-American working-class fiancée home to meet the Sinclairs of Hancock Park, the reception was glacial. Margaret Sinclair, David's mother, embodied everything Amelia was not: wealthy, socially connected, and steeped in generations of privilege. From their first meeting, Margaret made her disapproval clear through subtle slights, backhanded compliments, and the kind of social exclusion that left Amelia feeling like a permanent outsider at family gatherings. Robert Sinclair, David's father, was gentler but equally distant, offering polite tolerance rather than genuine acceptance. The family's resistance wasn't overtly racist. It was the more insidious prejudice of class and cultural assumptions. They questioned Amelia's motives for marrying David, wondered out loud about her background, and consistently treated her as someone who had married above her station, rather than as an equal partner in their son's life. Family dinners became exercises in diplomatic tension, with Amelia carefully monitoring every word while Margaret perfected the art of making her feel unwelcome without saying anything explicitly offensive. Elizabeth Morrison, Margaret's imperious sister, was even more direct in her disapproval. As a board member of prestigious institutions, she wielded social influence like a weapon, making it clear that Amelia would never be considered suitable for the family's social circle. The message was consistent across the extended family. David had made a mistake, and they were all waiting for him to realize it.
For 8 years, Amelia endured this treatment with dignity and grace. She built a successful career as an elementary school teacher in Riverside, where her innovative methods and genuine care for students earned widespread respect. She sent money to her parents monthly despite her and David's modest budget. She volunteered in her community and maintained her values while trying to find a way to belong in a family that seemed determined to keep her on the periphery. David found himself caught in the middle, defending his wife when necessary, but also trying to maintain family harmony. He knew his parents' treatment of Amelia was wrong, but he kept hoping they would eventually come around rather than forcing a confrontation that might fracture the family permanently. The family's carefully maintained dynamics shattered when Robert suffered acute kidney failure. At 68, he had ignored symptoms of declining kidney function until his body reached a critical point. The diagnosis was devastating: end-stage renal disease requiring immediate dialysis and ultimately a kidney transplant to survive. The search for a compatible donor began urgently. Family members were tested, but neither Margaret nor David proved to be viable matches. Elizabeth was ruled out due to her age and medical history. As Robert's condition deteriorated on dialysis, the family faced the terrifying possibility that no suitable donor would be found in time. During this crisis, something remarkable happened in the hospital waiting room. Margaret, exhausted and terrified of losing her husband, broke down completely in front of Amelia. For the first time in 8 years, the polished facade crumbled, revealing a frightened woman facing the potential loss of her life partner. In that moment of raw vulnerability, Amelia saw past the social barriers to the human being beneath. Without hesitation, Amelia arranged to be tested as a potential donor. She didn't consult David first, didn't calculate the risks to herself, and didn't consider how her gesture might be perceived by a family that had spent years questioning her motives. She simply acted from love. Love for David, compassion for Robert, and perhaps most surprisingly, empathy for Margaret's terror at the prospect of becoming a widow. The test results revealed what seemed like a miracle. Amelia was a perfect match for Robert's kidney type, with compatibility markers that made her an ideal donor for Emmy.
Dr. Patricia Wells, the transplant coordinator, was amazed by the genetic match between two people with no blood relationship. More importantly, Amelia's overall health and her previous blood donation history made her an excellent candidate for the donation surgery. The family's reaction to Amelia's offer was complex and emotionally charged. Margaret was overwhelmed with gratitude, but also guilt, knowing she was accepting this life-saving gift from someone she had spent years treating poorly. Robert was deeply moved by Amelia's willingness to undergo major surgery for his benefit, recognizing the profound generosity of her sacrifice. David experienced a mixture of pride in his wife's character and anxiety about the medical risks she would face. The surgery, while routine for transplant teams, still carried significant risks for the donor, including infection, bleeding, and potential long-term complications. Elizabeth, perhaps surprisingly, was the first to acknowledge what Amelia's offer represented. In a private conversation with Margaret, she pointed out that they were witnessing the kind of selfless love they had claimed to value while failing to recognize it when it was displayed consistently over 8 years of family gatherings. The donation surgery took place on a Tuesday morning in late spring. While Amelia was undergoing the complex procedure to remove one of her healthy kidneys, her parents, Miguel and Elena Martinez, sat in the waiting room alongside the Sinclairs, the first time both families had occupied the same space. The shared anxiety about Amelia's surgery created an unexpected bond between people who had remained strangers despite their children's 8-year marriage. The surgery was successful. Robert's body accepted the new kidney immediately, his color improved within hours, and his prognosis went from terminal to excellent. Amelia's recovery was more difficult, requiring several days of careful monitoring and pain management, but emerged from the experience with her health intact and her character vindicated in ways she had never sought. The kidney donation forced every member of the Sinclair family to confront uncomfortable truths about their treatment of Amelia. Margaret, in particular, underwent what could only be described as a moral reckoning. Sitting beside Robert's hospital bed, watching his miraculous recovery made possible by Amelia's sacrifice, she could no longer maintain the fiction that her daughter-in-law was somehow unworthy of the family's respect and affection. The woman who had questioned Amelia's motives for 8 years was forced to acknowledge that someone who would undergo major surgery to save the life of a man whose wife had consistently made her feel unwelcome possessed a character that put her own to shame. Margaret began therapy to examine the prejudices and insecurities that had driven her behavior, embarking on the difficult work of understanding why she had felt so threatened by her son's choice of wife. Robert's gratitude was profound and transformative. As he regained his strength with his new kidney, he began to see Amelia not as an outsider who had married into the family, but as the family member whose sacrifice had given him a second chance at life. He started examining his own passive acceptance of Margaret's behavior, recognizing that his failure to actively welcome Amelia had been its own form of rejection. Elizabeth underwent her own evolution. Shocked by the realization that she had been wrong about everything, the woman she had dismissed as unsuitable had just demonstrated a level of character and selflessness that challenged everything Elizabeth thought she knew about worth and value. She began using her social influence differently, quietly working to create opportunities for Amelia that acknowledged her professional qualifications and personal excellence. 2 months after the celebration dinner that marked the beginning of the family's transformation, Amelia received a phone call that would test everyone's commitment to change. Margaret arrived at Amelia and David's house unannounced, disheveled and crying, unprecedented behavior for someone who had spent decades maintaining perfect composure. What Margaret revealed was devastating. 3 weeks before Robert's diagnosis, she had hired a private investigator to conduct a background check on Amelia. Driven by prejudice and paranoia, Margaret had paid $8,000 for a comprehensive investigation into every aspect of Amelia's life, from her college transcripts to her family's history to her romantic relationships before David. The 23-page report had revealed exactly what anyone who actually knew Amelia could have told Margaret for free.
She was a person of exceptional character who had overcome significant obstacles through hard work and moral integrity. College deans lists every semester, despite working to pay for expenses. Outstanding teaching evaluations praising her transformative impact on students. Bank records showing monthly support for her parents. Medical records documenting years of blood donation. A family history free of any criminal activity or questionable behavior. Margaret's confession was motivated not by a desire for absolution, but by the recognition that building a genuine relationship with Amelia while hiding such a fundamental violation would be fraudulent. She revealed the investigation because she understood that real change required complete honesty, even when that honesty might destroy the fragile progress they had made. David was furious, recognizing the investigation as a profound violation of his wife's privacy and a betrayal of trust that went beyond their previous family tensions. But Amelia, after processing her initial shock and hurt, chose to see Margaret's confession as evidence of genuine transformation rather than focusing solely on the violation itself. The investigation had confirmed what Amelia had always known about herself, but the fact that such confirmation had been necessary revealed the depth of Margaret's prejudices and fears. More importantly, Margaret's decision to reveal the investigation voluntarily, knowing it might cost her the relationship she was trying to build, demonstrated real growth and commitment to change. As the family worked through the emotional aftermath of Margaret's confession, Amelia found herself facing new professional opportunities. Elizabeth, who had seen the investigators' report and been forced to acknowledge Amelia's exceptional qualifications, offered her a position at Westmont Academy, one of the region's most prestigious private schools.
Initially, Amelia was suspicious of the offer, wondering whether it was motivated by guilt rather than genuine recognition of her abilities. But conversations with Elizabeth revealed that the position was offered based purely on professional merit. The investigation had simply forced Elizabeth to acknowledge what she should have seen all along. After careful consideration, Amelia accepted the position, not as a family favor, but as recognition of qualifications that spoke for themselves. At Westmont Academy, she implemented innovative programs that drew from students' diverse cultural backgrounds, created inclusive curricula that honored different learning styles, and developed approaches that improved educational outcomes across all demographic groups. Her success at Westmont led to speaking opportunities at educational conferences, consultation requests from other institutions, and eventually national recognition for her contributions to inclusive education. The teacher who had once felt invisible in her own family became a voice for educational equity and cultural responsiveness. Meanwhile, the family's transformation continued to deepen. Margaret's therapy helped her understand the sources of her prejudices and insecurities, leading to genuine changes in how she interacted with people outside her traditional social circle. She began volunteering with immigrant families, learning Spanish, and using her social connections to promote educational equity initiatives. Robert became an advocate for organ donation, speaking publicly about how Amelia's gift had not only saved his life, but transformed his family's understanding of love and sacrifice. Elizabeth used her board positions to promote diversity and inclusion, recognizing that her previous narrow-mindedness had limited her ability to identify and support exceptional talent. 5 years after the kidney donation, the Sinclair family bore little resemblance to the closed, tradition-bound group that had once made Amelia feel like an outsider. Margaret and Robert had become not just accepting in-laws, but genuine friends who valued Amelia's perspectives and contributions. They had learned Spanish to communicate better with her parents, regularly attended cultural events in her community, and had developed real relationships with Elena and Miguel Martinez. David and Amelia's marriage had been strengthened by weathering the family crisis together and emerging with relationships based on mutual respect rather than mere tolerance. They had 2 children, Sophia and Miguel,
who grew up surrounded by grandparents who spoke multiple languages and honored diverse cultural traditions. The extended family had expanded to include not just blood relatives, but chosen family members who shared common values of acceptance, growth, and service to others. Family gatherings became genuine celebrations where disagreement was welcomed as a sign of mutual respect rather than feared as a threat to harmony. Amelia's professional success continued to grow. She became a nationally recognized expert on inclusive education, publishing research on culturally responsive pedagogy, and serving as a consultant to school districts working to better serve diverse student populations. Her work was featured in a documentary about educational innovation that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and sparked conversations about family dynamics, prejudice, and transformation. Margaret's evolution was perhaps the most dramatic. The woman who had once hired an investigator to validate her prejudices became one of the most effective advocates for educational equity in California, using her social connections and resources to fund scholarship programs and lobby for policy reforms. She often spoke about how Amelia's sacrifice had forced her to examine her own character and find it lacking, motivating her to become someone worthy of the grace she had been shown. The story of Amelia's kidney donation and the family's transformation had ripple effects that extended far beyond the Sinclair family circle. Margaret's cousin Patricia apologized directly for years of subtle slights, beginning her own process of examining how privilege and prejudice had shaped her interactions with others. David's cousin Michael started mentoring children from low-income families, inspired by Amelia's example of service without expectation of reward. Former students from Amelia's early teaching career, like Marcus, who had struggled with reading but became inspired by her patient encouragement, pursued careers in education themselves, carrying forward her methods and philosophy to new generations of learners. The documentary about the family's transformation sparked conversations in communities across the country about how prejudice operates in families, how privilege can blind people to others' worth, and how genuine change is possible when people are willing to do the difficult work of examining their own assumptions and behaviors. Elizabeth, despite being in her 80s, became an unexpected advocate for social justice, using her final years to promote causes she had previously ignored. She often remarked that Amelia had corrupted her into caring about issues beyond her own narrow circle, and she meant it as the highest possible compliment. 2 years after Robert's transplant, the family marked the anniversary with a celebration that would have been unimaginable during the early years of Amelia's marriage to David. The gathering included not just the Sinclair extended family, but also Amelia's parents, her sister Rosa, colleagues from Westmont Academy, and former students from Lincoln Elementary who wanted to celebrate their beloved teacher's success. Robert's toast that evening captured the full scope of what had changed. 2 years ago, I was dying. My kidneys were failing, my body was shutting down, and my family was preparing to lose me. But Amelia made a choice that saved not just my life, but all of our lives in different ways. She didn't just give me her kidney, she gave us all an example of what it means to love without conditions, to extend grace without guarantees, to choose generosity even when it's not reciprocated. Margaret's response was equally powerful. 2 years ago, I was a woman who hired investigators to validate her prejudices rather than challenging herself to grow beyond them. I was so threatened by difference that I couldn't recognize excellence when it was sitting at my dinner table for 8 years. Amelia saved Robert's life, but she also saved mine. She forced me to confront the ways I had been living in fear rather than love, judgment rather than grace, limitation rather than possibility. The celebration continued late into the evening, with conversation flowing easily between generations, cultures, and social backgrounds. Children played together while adults shared stories, laughed at family jokes that now included everyone, and made plans for future gatherings that would continue to strengthen bonds forged through crisis and sustained through intentional effort. The story reached its culmination 5 years later when Dr. Amelia Martinez Sinclair stood at the podium of the Kennedy Center, accepting the National Education Association's highest honor for innovative teaching and educational leadership. The award recognized her groundbreaking work in inclusive education, her research on culturally responsive pedagogy, and her role in transforming not just individual schools, but entire districts' approaches to serving diverse student populations. In the audience sat the remarkable gathering that represented the full arc of her journey. Margaret and Robert, now in their 70s but radiating health and pride, David holding their children Sophia and Miguel, Elena and Miguel Martinez in clothes fit for the occasion, Rosa with her own family, Elizabeth, despite her age and health issues, and dozens of former students who had been touched and transformed by Amelia's teaching. In her acceptance speech, Amelia reflected on the journey from being an unwelcome daughter-in-law to becoming a nationally recognized educational leader. The real miracle wasn't the kidney donation that saved my father-in-law's life. The real miracle was what happened next, how a family learned to see past their prejudices, how love conquered fear, and how transformation became possible when people were willing to do the hard work of examining their own hearts. She concluded with a message that had become central to both her educational philosophy and her approach to family relationships. Every child deserves to be seen for their potential, rather than judged by others' limitations. Every family member deserves to be valued for who they are, rather than dismissed for who they're not. And every person deserves the chance to grow beyond their mistakes into the person they're capable of becoming. The story of Amelia Martinez Sinclair and the Sinclair family demonstrates how a single choice made from love can create ripple effects that transform multiple lives across generations. What began as a medical crisis became a catalyst for examining prejudices, rebuilding relationships, and creating new definitions of family based on mutual respect rather than social convention.
Amelia's decision to donate her kidney wasn't calculated to win acceptance or prove her worth. It was simply the right thing to do. But that single act of love had consequences none of them could have anticipated. A marriage strengthened by weathering crisis together, a family transformed by confronting their own limitations, a woman's character finally recognized and celebrated, and countless lives touched by the ripple effects of genuine change. The kidney donation gave Robert 5 additional years of life and counting. But perhaps more importantly, it gave an entire family the opportunity to become the people they had the potential to be all along. People capable of growth, change, and unconditional love. Margaret often said in her later years that Amelia had saved 2 lives that day, Robert's through medical intervention and her own through moral example. The woman who had once spent $8,000 investigating her daughter-in-law's background became one of her closest friends and most ardent supporters, proving that even the deepest prejudices can be overcome when people are willing to do the difficult work of change. The story reminds us that families are not just biological accidents, but conscious choices we make every day to love, support, and accept each other. It demonstrates that transformation is possible at any age, that character ultimately reveals itself through actions rather than words, and that the greatest gifts we can give each other are often the ones that cost us the most, but enrich us in ways we never expected. Today, the Sinclair family legacy is not one of social status or inherited wealth, but of love triumphant over prejudice, of growth chosen over comfort, and of a daughter-in-law who became the heart of a family that almost lost the chance to know her worth. Thank you for joining me for this powerful story of transformation, sacrifice, and the triumph of love over prejudice. If you found this tale as moving as I did, please consider subscribing to hear more incredible stories of human resilience, family dynamics, and the unexpected ways our choices can change everything. Your subscription helps me continue sharing these meaningful narratives that remind us of our capacity for growth, change, and unconditional love. Hit that subscribe button, and let's explore more stories that illuminate the very best of human nature together.